Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name's James Harding. I'm the editor and founder of Tortoise. And if I get a little tongue-tied, it's because I'm a little starstruck. It is a great thing to have Elif Shafak in our newsroom. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Welcome.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
I was explaining to Elif that when we started Tortoise, one of the founding ideas was that journalism was too interesting and too fun and too much of a privilege to be confined only to journalists. We should all get to have a go to talk to someone like Elif. And that's, if you've not been to a ThinkIn before, that's the principle of the way this thing works. It's not going to be a kind of in-depth interview with then 4 minutes left for questions from the room. The idea is that we have a conversation that includes us all. So from the very beginning, if you've got something that you want to say, we're really interested in what you think. So where possible, we've got preferences for you to share your views on things and then to hear Elif's view in return. Please do just catch my eye. I don't know the name of everyone in this room, so if you would just introduce yourself, that would be a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I hope we can have a conversation that touches on Elif's writing, your capacity, I think, for inspiring people at a time where there's despair is doing quite a swift trade. But also I thought talking in particular about the writing you've done recently around democracy and understanding and human rights, not just the picture that you've painted of life in Turkey, but the picture you've painted here in the UK and more widely. And I was going to start, if I might, Elif, by picking up on something in one of the books that you wrote where you describe yourself as a Londoner. And I remember reading that and thinking, yes, this is a Londoner we'll have. We'd be proud to have you. And I think anyone who's a Londoner thinks this is one of the best things about being a Londoner is that we're a city that brings people from all over the world. Yeah. But in your case, you really have had a life that has moved all over the world. So how did you come to be a Londoner?
Well, thank you so much. It's really, really very nice to be and very inspiring to be here. I was born in Strasbourg in France. But I did not live there for a long time because shortly afterwards my parents got separated. My father stayed in France, he got remarried, and then my mother brought me to Turkey, to Ankara, because for her Turkey was home. For me it was a new country. We came to my grandmother's house. This was a very conservative neighborhood in the middle of Ankara. I was raised thereafter, mostly by my grandmother, but by these two women who were very different, my mother and my grandmother. I was raised by women. And later on, my mother started working in Spain, so I went to Madrid with her, back to Turkey, then I moved to Istanbul. There was a time in Jordan, Amman, a little bit in Germany, but always back to Istanbul. And I loved Istanbul, and I think Istanbul shaped my thinking, my stories in so many ways. I started publishing my books from my early 20s onwards, but I also felt very suffocated in Turkey for various reasons. Maybe we'll talk about those as well. As a writer, you will find Turkey very inspiring, but you're going to long for freedom of speech. You're going to long for, especially I think for women writers, it's harder. There are lots of layers. So I moved to America. I lived in Boston, Michigan, Arizona.
Wow.
Back to Istanbul. Again in love with Istanbul, but after a while I was put on trial for writing a book called The Bastard of Istanbul. That madness went on for about a year. And after that I thought, this is time for me to leave Turkey now. And I wanted to come to London. This might sound like a cliche for people, but to me it is not. I do treasure the fact that London is so diverse. I do not take it for granted. And I'm saying this as someone who comes from a country that has almost never appreciated its own cultural diversity. And I think by losing that respect for diversity, we have lost a lot. I'm not talking about a financial loss, political loss, something deeper, in our collective psyche. So for me, diversity is a value, is a treasure. I also wanted to come to London because I was writing in English. I switched to writing in English about 15 years ago. Maybe we'll talk about that. So the English language also became home for me. To me, this is important because, as you can hear in my accent, in my mispronunciation, I did not grow up bilingual. For me, English is an acquired language. I'm an immigrant writer in this language, but this language itself became home to me. Yeah, so for a variety of reasons, London became my home.
And Elif, I think you wrote somewhere that you were an only child and a lonely child.
Yeah.
And that at that time you were befriended by stories, or you found comfort in stories. Obviously, one of the themes that you've written a lot about is this idea of finding sanity through stories.
Yeah.
What were those early stories? How did they affect you, and then how has your thinking about stories grown as a result of that?
When I say books can save us or books can help us, I really mean it, because it happened to me. I've experienced this. As I mentioned, I was raised by a grandma who was a bit of a storyteller, actually. My grandmother was not a very well-educated woman. Actually, she had been pulled out of school for being a girl, and she wholeheartedly supported women's education. She wholeheartedly supported her own daughter's independence. And because she did that patriarchal chain was broken. I saw it happen, and I'm a big believer in sisterhood. I think when and if women support each other, especially at difficult moments in our lives, if we support each other, the impact of that kind of support goes beyond generations. So because she stepped at a critical moment in my mother's life and supported my mother's independence, my mother had a career, my mother was able to rebuild her life, and that changed my life and probably my children's lives as well. So it really goes beyond generations. And in that sense, I think she left a big impact on me, even though she was not a very, educated woman by, these typical descriptions of highbrow literature, lowbrow literature, whatever that means. I never believe in those dualities. What I'm trying to say is I love stories. And to the best of my ability, I would love my work to bridge written culture and oral culture. And I think, especially if you're interested in the silences, because official historiography is full of silences. We have to ask the question, who is telling the story and who is not allowed to tell the story? And the moment you ask the second question, you realize the stories of women. Where are they? Most of the history that we know and has been recorded and archived and transmitted is actually his story. Most of the history that I learn in Turkey is the story of men, but men in positions of power, not working class men, not men from minority backgrounds, not men from disadvantaged backgrounds, men in positions of power. So sultans, Shaykhul Islams, you learn about them, commanders and generals, dates of wars, peace treaties. Where are the women? The moment you ask yourself, how was the Ottoman Empire like for maybe an Armenian silversmith, or a Jewish miller, or a Kurdish peasant, or a woman or a concubine in the harem, then suddenly the narrative shifts. So my point is, if we are interested in silences, we have to pay attention to oral history as well as written history, because there are things that official history has erased, forgotten, conveniently so, but people still remember because they still survive in legends, stories, lullabies. And I think writers have to be a bit like archaeologists, linguistic, cultural archaeologists. We need to dig deep to find those untold stories.
Yeah, there's one of this theme about listening out for stories, but listening out for silences, not going to the center, going to the periphery.
Yeah.
In effect, hearing people who are unheard.
Yeah.
A lot of what you've been writing about in recent years seems to be about that, both in, if you like, the world of politics, but also in the world of storytelling. What's the role of the imagination in that? And what's the role of actual listening?
It's such a beautiful question. I think writers need to be two things all our lives. We need to remain so. We need to be good readers. But when I say readers, let's please read across the board. Let's read fiction and nonfiction. Sometimes some readers, usually it's male readers, who come and say, so much is happening in the world. I want to keep up, so I'm reading important stuff. I read about technology, I read about finance, history, philosophy, but my wife reads fiction. So I really feel sad when I hear this, because I think, first of all, inside fiction there is everything. There is technology, there is psychology, there is history, philosophy. There is empathy. I don't know a single human being who doesn't need empathy. I don't know a single human being who doesn't need to connect with their emotional intelligence. So novels activate something else in our minds, and we need that. For me, it's very important to read fiction and non-fiction, East and West, not always the same type of, maybe Eurocentric literature. Let's open up. The world is full of stories. So we have to be good readers, curious readers. And the second thing is, I think we have to be good listeners. I try to listen to what people are saying, what they're saying, with what kind of energy, and learn from everyone. So what's the role of imagination? I think primarily being a novelist is about keeping the curiosity alive. Like we're students of life. We can never, ever graduate from that school. Always keep learning. Every book has taught me so much. By the time you finish a book, you're a different person. But if I may quickly add this, I just love asking questions, or I love opening up questions, including difficult questions about difficult issues, including taboos. There's a part of me that wants to say, can we please talk about this now, right? All these silences, buried silences. But I don't like it when writers try to dictate the answers to those questions. That's something completely different. So when a writer tries to preach or lecture or teach as if there's a hierarchy and the writer is above and the reader is here, that's nonsense. I don't know the answers. The only thing I know is that those questions matter, right? So you write those stories with multiplicity of voices, the multiplicity that we are denied in this age of populism. And then you have to leave the answers to the reader, because every reader is going to come up with their own answer. And I have to respect that. So I have met couples who have been married for 40 years. They read the same novel. They don't read it in the same way. One of them loves it, the other one not so. Good friends, they share everything. They read the same novel. They connect with completely different characters. Why? Because the reader is not passive. Every reader brings their own gaze into the story, and I have to respect that. But I think my job as a novelist is to open up those difficult conversations.
So can I also pick up on this point about good listeners? Good readers, I think, in a curious way, is easier than being a good listener, because you can pick books off the shelf. They may be different from the ones you expect, but it's something you can do on your own. Good listening requires often being in a room with someone whose views you deeply, deeply disagree with, might even be offended by. And it feels like we're living in that moment right now. When you think about what's happening, Israel and Gaza, I can't think of a time, Elif, when actually just the business of doing good listening is proving so hard. So how do you bring rooms of people together where you can listen to people who feel that the other side of the argument wants them run out of town, wants them to go unheard? How do you create the environments for good listening in these circumstances?
Yeah, such an important question. I make a distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom. And I think we are living in an age in which we are bombarded by information, but snippets of information, like little morsels of information. And if, we're old enough to remember late 1990s, early 2000s, there was so much optimism in the world. And the biggest optimists back then were the techno-optimists. They were telling us that thanks to digital technologies, especially thanks to social media platforms, democracy was going to spread like wildfire. The countries that were lagging behind, they were going to catch up, because how could they not? The arc of history would bend towards justice, and it had to be linear, progressive, and so on. Both in media and in academia, article after article was shaped by that kind of techno-optimism. And you will remember after the Arab Spring, there was so much optimism and trust in Facebook that a young couple in Egypt, they named their child after Facebook, right? I don't mean to make fun at all. It just shows the spirit of the time. And again, I remember 6 months later, a family in Israel this time, they named their third child like. So,
No.
because that was the spirit of the time. Now, fast forward, those kids have become teenagers, older than teenagers. And what kind of a world have we given them, to both children in Egypt and in Israel? It's a time of pessimism now. My point is, what went wrong is we relied too heavily on information. The idea was information spreads, people become informed citizens, and then they make the right choices. How can they not opt for democracy? But what extreme information does actually is the opposite of knowledge. Because if I'm just scrolling up and down, I learn a little bit about Chile, a little bit about, India, a little bit about this and that subject. It gives me the illusion that I know something about the subject. But if you question me, I know nothing, right, under that surface. So what happened was we forgot to say, I don't know. When was the last time we ever said, I don't know? We never say, I don't know anymore. And that's a terrible place to be, because I don't know, it was actually the beginning of, the starting point for many ancient Greek philosophers. Going all the back to Socrates, people were like, I don't know anything. Or when you look at agnostic philosophers, I don't know, I'm learning, I'm on a journey. I don't know was a good point. We lost that point. And now we're surrounded with this illusion of knowledge, which is not actual knowledge. It's just information. I haven't even added misinformation and disinformation into the picture. So what's happening is we have way too much information, very little knowledge, even less wisdom. How do we change that ratio? I don't think we should deal with this much information in our daily lives, because the truth is our brain doesn't process it, It's too much. And then we feel fatigue. We feel depressed because it just is a burden on ourselves. So let's instead focus on knowledge. And this is exactly what we're doing now, because knowledge means slow journalism. It means in-depth conversations. It means literary festivals. Spaces like this where we can hear each other, where we can disagree, but we have time for each other. And then hopefully let's aim for wisdom, which I think brings the heart and the mind together, because wisdom also requires empathy. Wisdom requires emotional connection. I think wisdom requires to shorten the distance between us and them, and then you realize, actually, the other is my brother, the other is my sister, I am the other. That's towards wisdom. But all I'm saying is, I think too much information has been incredibly destructive for us.
And then just, will you talk through your idea of group narcissism in that context? Because it's very hard to get to that knowledge when we're in our groups.
What's so scary is certainty. When I listen to people who are extremely sure of their religiosity, this extreme certainty, this idea that there's an us versus them and us is closer to God. I cannot relate to that. When I sometimes speak or listen to atheists who are quite staunch atheists, there's another certainty there as well. That's why maybe I feel closer to agnostics who can say, I don't know, or mystics who are a little bit of misfits. They were walking a very thin line between faith and doubt. Let faith and doubt dance together, let them challenge each other. All I'm trying to say is, when we're so certain of our truths, of our own convictions, it becomes incredibly dangerous. And then when we are so certain as a group, it's even more dangerous. Then there's a hierarchy, and we forget that we're here to learn. My point is, what we've lost through social media is a proper intellectual exchange. A real intellectual exchange means I have my opinions. It's not like I don't have my opinions, but I'm here to listen to you. And if what you say makes sense to me, my door is open. I haven't shut it, and I can revise my opinions. That is a proper intellectual exchange, and I think that's something we have lost in the age of social media.
And please tuck in, yes, there's a gentleman here and Tess, a former colleague of mine here. Hello, Tess. Tess, will you just wait for a mic? We wait for a mic, just 1 second. Thank you, Lily.
It's a real, it's a real joy to hear you speak. Thank you very much. Back to you. I just want to run back to the silences, the gaps, the unseen, the unheard. And I struggle with the point you're making about the volume and the lack of filter and the sort of the inability to simply process the amount of information that comes our way. But I wonder how much we lose sight of the trade-off, which is the democratization of access to a voice. The exchanges you're talking about, all of which I, live for, are the preserve of a few. And do we lose sight of what social media has given us in terms of an access to voices we would never hear, direct access to the world? And do we lose sight of that somewhere along the way because of we lose sight of the upsides? Those villages can talk to other villages, they can talk to other towns, we can talk to other countries, we can have a direct line into people's lives and worlds that we never had access to before.
I really, really appreciate the question. And I think you're absolutely right. For me, social media is a bit like the moon. It does have a bright side. It does have a darker side, an unseen side. Because we were short-sighted in 1990s and late 1990s and early 2000s, and in general, that other side of social media was neglected, unseen. I think this is a time when we need to put more emphasis on that side. But otherwise, you're absolutely right. How can I belittle the importance of social media? For instance, as a woman, how can I do that? As a woman coming from the Middle East, how can I belittle that? As a woman coming from Turkey, how can I belittle that? And I'll give you examples. In Turkey, the more traditional media shrunk, under restrictions and rising authoritarianism, the more people went to social media. At the time, Twitter became very important, for instance. As you said, it connected people. Also for many women across the world, but especially in the region where I come from, where in the public space you're not represented equally, many women and young people and minorities try to carve out spaces for themselves within the digital platforms. Again, I respect that. But there's a limit. Again, when we are bombarded with these images, when we become, pushed into boxes of others, and we stop hearing each other, I think we need to be alert. A little bit more pessimism is actually okay. Creative pessimism, as well as a combination of hope and optimism. We need both in this time. So we can't go too much in either direction. And the second thing I want to add is, I wouldn't want in this world to have anyone to have extreme power. I don't think no politician, no political party, no institution, and no tech company should have extreme power. So this monopolization of power is something that I'm afraid of, worried about. And many times people with good intentions think, well, technology is too complicated. Let's leave it to people who know the subject. Let's not do that. Let's talk about technology. Let's be part of this conversation. Let's voice our worries. We need to engage in this conversation because we've seen what happens when we just leave it to them. So all of my point is, let's be a little bit more pessimistic and worried so that we can be part of this conversation.
So just before I come to you, and I'm going to come to you soon in a moment, can I just ask you one thing, Elif, about stories and storytelling, though, in the face of the technologies you described? Because some people say that actually the experience of either listening to or reading stories has been destroyed by the new attention economy created by these technologies. So if your answer is the story, but people are not receptive to it, what do you do then?
Yeah, this is actually so interesting. I gave 2 TED Talks. I think it was like 10 years apart. When I first gave a global TED Talk, it was in Oxford. Back then, our guidelines were you're going to speak for about 19 minutes, 20 minutes, so prepare a talk. Years later, when I gave the second TED Talk, the guidelines were, you're going to give a talk for about 13 minutes, 12, better. Really. So get ready. I said, why? Why did you shorten? And they said, well, the global attention span has went down. Now, this is interesting. So can we not listen to a talk for more than 20 minutes? So on the one hand, it's quite depressing. But on the other hand, there's, I think, an unseen side to the story. Because everything is so fast moving and because we're so tired, actually, and this is the age of angst, there is a lot of anxiety. And we find it difficult to talk about this because we are worried that the moment we bring anxiety into the public space, people are going to think we are weak, we're vulnerable, we're delicate, you know. I think we need to talk about anxiety, the age of anxiety, especially how it's affecting teenagers, younger generations. How can it not affect when we talk about climate destruction, you know, rising authoritarianism? As we're speaking, wars are happening and widening inequalities. Of course, it's going to make us worried. Not to talk about it is not the solution. So my point is, you know, how do we turn these into something more positive, something more constructive? But first, we need to recognize that we're affected by these emotions. Just to wrap it up, you might expect, you know, given all these anxieties and shortening attention spans, people wouldn't read books, for instance. People wouldn't read novels, especially because novel is like long-term attention. But actually, the novel is still not dead. I cannot tell you how many times I read articles, again, since early 1990s, saying the novel is dead, the novel is dead, the novel is dying as a genre. It's not dying. So something interesting is happening. The faster we run, the deeper our need for slow journalism. The faster we run, the deeper our need for spiritual connections or for reading novels. The opposite is also happening, and I think we need to see that too.
Thank you. Sir.
My name is Tom Schiller, and I think you both made a very eloquent case for lifelong learning. And as someone whose professional life has been in adult education, I was very pleased to hear that. Although the sad side is that actually spaces for adult learning have been declining, in physical spaces where people meet each other and talk, in this country at least, have been declining very, very significantly over the last 15 years. But I wanted to ask or raise a slightly different issue. You both used the word imagination, and I'm really interested in how images and metaphors can be used to encourage debate, discussion, and thought. I mean, I love your books, and I love the Fig Tree book with that as a sort of metaphor. And I wonder if you could just say something more about how you think images, metaphors, similes, these kinds of things that aren't necessarily direct verbal communication can be used to improve the kinds of discussions that we have.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you so much. So appreciated. Yeah, I think this sensuality, if that's the right word, it's interesting to me how when we go down this memory lane, most of the stuff that we remember from childhood, you know, all these bits and pieces of memories, they come to us with senses attached, right? I mean, this is, of course, at the heart of what Proust was doing. You just dip the Madeleine in a cup of tea and it takes you back to your childhood. But it's the taste, just that this ordinary taste or smell of something, it takes you back in time. This is also scientifically proven, actually. And there are interesting studies that show, for instance, when we go to a talk, and if the talk is given mostly via numbers and statistics and graphics and all that, the next day, 24 hours later, we have forgotten a big chunk of that talk. 3 days later, even a huge, amount of the talk has evaporated. But if the speaker tells the same things with stories attached, with emotions attached, then we remember. I think no one said it better than, Maya Angelou. She said, people might forget what you've done to them. People might even forget what you've said to them, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And it's those feelings that have long-term memory. So whether it's the fig tree, maybe the smell of fig, or how you felt next to a fig tree, something you shared, but very sensual, almost abstract. It's so interesting that in human memory, those stay long-term, and those are the ones that trigger memories. So I think for me as a storyteller, I always, when I think of Istanbul, when I think of any story, it comes to me with those senses attached.
Will you just say, this is an extension of Tom's question, how does the way in which you experience the world and express your experience of it, how has that changed since you moved into writing in English?
That's a brilliant question. It did change. It did change. And actually, I'm always intrigued. I don't know if in this room there are people who switch, who dream in more than one language. I think it's fascinating. Sometimes we express our anger better in one language. I know many Turkish women, who have been raised within those patriarchal codes. We can never swear in Turkish, but in English. They swear. I hear them swearing in English. It's lighter, somehow not as heavy as swearing in Turkish. So it's interesting how culture, memories, the feelings we attach to languages. All I can tell you is I feel connected to each language deeply. And Turkish nationalists do not understand this. They say, how can a writer abandon her language? I've not abandoned Turkish. Mm-hmm. How can I ever abandon my mother tongue? But what happened was I wrote my earlier novels in Turkish. And about 15, 16 years ago now, I switched. That's because I needed another zone of existence. It's a bit like you need a cognitive space, a distance. When you want to see a picture better, you don't get closer, you take a step back. English gave me that cognitive distance. I love the fact that when you speak English, you say chutzpah, you say kısmet. Nobody says, wait a second, the first one is a Jewish word, the second one is an Arabic word, let's take them out of the English language. Mm-hmm. Nobody says that. Those are part of the English language, organically. I like that, So I'm always curious about language. In Turkey, we have Turkified our language, and we've lost lots of old words. When I write in Turkish, I use both old words and new words. I like nuances of language. So in a nutshell, for me, language is not an instrument. I think languages shape us more than we realize. And what I found out over the years is I love writing in English. And then each book is translated into Turkish by a professional translator. Then I reshape it with my own rhythm, with my own old words. It's a little bit insane. You have to travel or you have to work twice as much. You can only do it if you love language. But all I noticed over the years is if my writing has melancholy, longing, loss, I still find these things much easier to express in Turkish.
Wow.
But when it comes to humor, which I love, I think humor is our oxygen, is how we breathe. When it comes to humor, irony and satire, I find it much easier in English.
Amazing. There's a gentleman here and there's a lady there. So, and there's someone in the back there. Actually, we'll do the gentleman in the back and then the lady that come to you, sir, if that's all right. Thank you.
Hi. A question and a remark. You distinguished information, knowledge, and wisdom, which I think is drawn from Eliot's quote, where is the wisdom lost in knowledge and where is the knowledge lost in information? And I'm wondering who you'd recommend. I feel there's a lack of writers and cultural figures generally who are helping us to understand the transformations we're making to society through technology, for want of a better term. Do you feel that's the same way? And I'm thinking partly Ian Forster wrote a book called The Machine Stops, which was a literary science fiction novel in the early 20th century. But I don't feel there are that many writers who are really trying to help us, or cultural figures trying to help us navigate and understand and make sense of the modern world in as much as it's shaped by technology. And is that your perception, or is that, do I just not read enough? Fiction or non-fiction? And secondly, I really liked your comment about listening and about asking questions and about not knowing the answers. And in fact, what's her name? The Treasury Secretary was on the radio this morning talking about the Rwanda bill and was asked a question about it, whether it applied in Northern Ireland, said, I don't know. And I can't remember the last time I heard a politician say that. The Today programme clarified later on that it does apply in Northern Ireland. I thought we were 4 nations, but anyway. But then after that, you referred to populism, and I heard a sort of disparaging tone in that. And I'm afraid, among a tortoise audience, I think populism may be unpopular. And yet you talk about listening to people, and I think populism is an expression of people who want to be heard and feel frustrated they're not heard. and particularly after the Brexit referendum, not popular in this room probably, felt even more unheard when people tried to undermine that and question democracy and their vote and their intelligence and their knowledge and so on. So I wonder, might you rethink, if you were disparaging populism, which you might not be, you're making a judgment and answering the question rather than listening?
Nika, thank you. It's two big questions, but if I'm just going to take a few points together, because I was just in front of, there you are, ma'am, yes. I'm going to take you, and then sir, and then we're going to kind of try and treat us together.
Elşin Kurtuluş. I really resonate with what you said about being able to express feelings of sadness and longing better in Turkish. I very much feel the same way. But my question was something that you touched on right at the beginning, which is about diversity, and also, incidentally, the loss of words. And I presume you mean the older kind of Arabic words that used to be a big part of Turkish and now are not, that have been Turkified out of it. That feeling of kind of sadness is something that I feel very much when I'm in Istanbul. It's like a tangible feeling of, it's almost like chewable, this like sadness in Istanbul. And it is very, very difficult to explain as somebody that is Turkish and, growing up with a Greek grandmother who was traditionally from Istanbul, looking at things from her perspective as a Greek who finds her community diminishing over the years, as opposed to the Turkish community, which she married into, growing over the years. There's a question for me in how do you explain the sadness of the loss of diversity from the point of view of the people who have benefited from it, or from the majority point of view, rather than from the minority point of view, which my grandmother held and which a lot of your characters hold in your books as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to come to you in a minute because both of those are such huge, big subjects to get tucked into. Yes. Amazing questions, really. I really appreciate. With regards to technology and many writers touching upon this or exploring them in their topics, absolutely, from H.G. Wells to E.M. Forster. Actually, many of their predictions were actualized. So what they wrote about, what they foresaw, I find it very important. The whole, not only science fiction, or now they call it cli-fi, climate fiction, but in broader terms, I think literature contributes a lot to how do we make sense of this world, of the anxiety of this world, of this fast-changing world. Post-Brexit Britain as well, there are lots of writers who have dealt with this. And I think in today's, among fiction writers from Alice Smith to Ian McEwan, amazing writers have stepped in, which is not easy because Doris Lessing has this beautiful essay where she says, literature is analysis after the event. So things happen, you need time to pass, right? To process, to absorb. Then we look back and retrospectively we produce literature. But because of the world we're living in, I think we've entered a moment in time when literature has to be both analysis after the event, but also analysis during the event, right? So we have to do both things at the same time as writers. And I think, especially as novelists, for us, this is a massive challenge. I think I'm going to jump to the populism question. You're right. I'm not using the word populism in a very glowing, positive sense. And I'll tell you why. But also, I want you to know that I respect what you're saying, because if I hear you correctly, you're telling me this is happening because many people feel left out and left behind. And this is happening because of widening inequalities. And that's the part that I respect, because I think we need to talk about those widening inequalities. We need to talk about gender inequality, racial inequality, class inequality, regional inequality, right? And I think we are living in a moment in time when we cannot be single issue people. If I care about climate,
I have to care about gender inequality. At the moment, every story of freshwater crisis, because climate crisis is water crisis is freshwater crisis. Every story of freshwater crisis that's happening right now in the world shows that people are facing displacement. The moment there is displacement, women are the water carriers, right? So the amount of distance that a woman has to walk doubles, triples. The amount of gender violence that she's subjected to escalates. Everything is connected. If I care about gender inequality, I have to talk about racial inequality. I have to care about regional inequality. So a more intersectional approach. I am a feminist, and for me, intersectional feminism is important. We have to connect the dots. But coming back to populism, that question, like, hear me out. There is an injustice. There are inequalities. Things are not okay. Not everyone is at the table taking part in decision making. You're absolutely right. Where I differ from you, I think, is, in my opinion, populism is not the answer. And I think I worry that populism makes things worse. What populism does is to create the illusion that the people is a homogeneous block, a monolithic whole, and some people are representatives of the voice of the people, which is a big illusion. And then it creates this duality of the elite, because populism needs an other, right? So people versus elite. But oftentimes people who claim to be speaking for the people are actually part of the elite. So it's a huge illusion going on. My point is, it's a bit dangerous to think that, we have to create homogeneous masses, right? We have our diversity. The hardest task is, how do we communicate without losing democracy? Countries like Turkey show us, because Turkey has elections, let us not forget, what it shows us, that the ballot box in itself is not enough to sustain a democracy. I'm not belittling the ballot box or the referendum at all, but in itself is not enough. So in addition to voting, we have to have institutions. You need rule of law, separation of powers. Again, no one should be too powerful in this world. We need accountability. So checks and balances, free media, diverse media, independent academia, women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights, together with all those components, plus the ballot box, a democracy can survive. The moment the institutions are broken, right, and the democratic language is broken, and we start seeing each other as enemies or enemies of the people, which is very dangerous, then when those norms are eroded, you only end up with the ballot box. And that is not democracy, that's majoritarianism. And from majoritarianism into authoritarianism, it's a very quick fall. That's all I'm saying. About the Turkish experience, I really hear you, from your Greek grandmother's point of view, the ruins, the remnants, the melancholy of all that is lost. Again, who remembers? I think Turkey is an amazing country. It's a very multi-layered country. I will never, reduce it to a single thread. And it's a country with a very rich and long history, but that doesn't mean strong memory. I think we're a society of amnesia, collective amnesia. And so for the majority that you were telling me about, the easiest thing is to forget. But for the minorities, you cannot forget. So the healthiest thing is actually, as human beings, we need to be able to forget a little bit so that we can move on. But for that to happen, the majority has to remember first. Right? So memory is a big part of the conversation. Memory is needed to heal, for individual healing and collective healing. If we don't remember, we repeat the same mistakes. What is repressed comes back. So, of course, let us not be stuck in the past, but we need to have honest conversations about the past so that we can move forward and hopefully never ever make those mistakes again.
Elif, you mentioned your prosecution in Turkey, and you talked just now about majoritarianism and authoritarianism. Just before we go to the next run of thoughts and questions, what is the state of Turkey today? How do you describe Turkey, and how do you explain the relative neglect of Turkey in the rest of the world?
I think it's a very important country, and what happens in Turkey has implications, has repercussions across the region. It is a complicated country. As you know, it was an empire. Then it turned. Then we built a nation state. That transformation from empire to nation state. It's interesting, and there are things that might resonate with a British audience. What we have learned growing up was that we were a mighty empire. We brought justice wherever we went, you know. Empires have their skeletons. Empires have, you know, their cupboards. Every nation, I think, has its difficult chapters in its history, but where there is a big distinction is if a country is a proper democracy, you can walk into a bookstore and you can find books that question the official narrative. And the authors of those books are not jailed. And the authors of those books are not prosecuted. Or you can find journalists who question, who say, wait a second, look, this is what I found. I want to talk about Windrush. And that journalist is not prosecuted. These are important things for me, right? So otherwise, let's talk about empires, you know, the good and the bad, calmly, in a nuanced way. That's important. But in Turkey, we're not there yet. However, I don't want to paint a completely, dark picture. It's also a surprising country, full of energy. If you talk to women, if you talk to young people, very young population, minorities, their resilience, their struggles will give you hope, like it gave us hope in the local elections. So I would never associate the government and the people. That's a big lesson I've learned in Turkey. The irony, the paradox of countries like my motherland is, in Turkey, I think the people are ahead of their governments, right? So when we only look at the government or reduce a country to a government, we're doing a big injustice to the entire civil society.
So there's a gentleman here, and Paul, can come to you, and there's a gentleman there too. So, at the front.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Mario Theodorou. I wanted to thank you for the Island of Missing Trees.
Okay.
I'm from Cyprus, and my dad's a refugee from the north, and my mum's from the south, and my grandfather and uncle had to flee to Australia after hiding people in their village for 20 years. And you talk about the silences. Well, that's a story that isn't heard. Now, I've never read or seen anything about the division in Cyprus, and it's still a live issue, obviously. Yeah. And just on the smelling thing, when I smell jasmine, I'm in Cyprus, no matter where I am. But what I wanted to ask you was, how when you sit down to write a book as beautiful as that, but with such a hot, conflict that's still happening, how much of a burden is it to address that, or how much of a joy is it? Like, did you sit down and think, this is something I need to talk about, but there is a heavy weight that comes with it? Because in my community, it's that book has just sort of ripped through like wildfire, because we don't speak about it. Yeah. So I just want to know what the process is like for you when you sit down to write something that is so active in that way.
Thank you.
Take it then. I'll go to this gentleman. I'll come to you, Paul.
Yeah, I really want to thank you for your words, because it wasn't an easy story for me to write. I've been wanting to write about Cyprus actually for a very long time, and I couldn't dare. I didn't know even how to approach the story, because as you said, the partition, unfortunately, is very much alive. The wounds are alive in the sense that they're not healed, right? And depending on whom you talk to, there are clashing memories. It's a beautiful island, such a beautiful island, but at the same time, there's so much suffering, difficult memories. What struck me most was this intergenerational trauma. That's how I see it. And different generations deal with the trauma of the past in different ways. So the oldest generations, the ones who suffered the most, they don't talk about it. It's like buried in their chest. Of course, they haven't forgotten. How can they forget? But they don't talk about it. The second generation, especially in immigrant families, or any family that has experienced displacement, like from north to south or vice versa, I think they don't talk about it either, because they have to build a new life. Understandably, they have to be forward-looking. They have to find their feet, rebuild their lives. But interestingly, that leaves the third or the fourth generations. The youngest in these families are asking the sharpest, the biggest questions about memory, their ancestors' heritage, their grandparents' story, and they're not afraid of asking those questions. So you can come across young people carrying really old memories. And that to me is remarkable. If I can quickly add this, I really couldn't dare to approach the story until I found this fig tree. Only then, so it might sound weird for me to say this, but I feel so grateful to the tree because it gave me the opportunity to approach the story from a completely different angle. Because how do you tackle such a subject without yourself falling into the trap of nationalism or tribalism or taking side? Or, I grew up with lots of stories about Greeks as the other. I'm sure you have been raised with lots of stories about, Turks as the other. How do we go beyond that, but without diminishing anyone's suffering or, glossing over what happened in the past? So very quickly, the fig tree was important because those of you who might have read the book will remember this. It's so interesting. I mean, I saw fig trees being buried, like in Michigan, in Canada, because it's such a Mediterranean tree. If the winter is too harsh, they dig a trench, they push the tree gently, it loses some of its roots, and come next spring, you cover it, come next spring, you unearth it. And it survives the cold. This metaphor for me was very, very important. As you know, in Cyprus, there's a communal organization launched by the United Nations, but it's the Cypriots who are doing the real work, Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots working together. Most of them are young people, most of them are women. And basically what they're doing is they're digging the ground to find the bones of people who went missing during the time of troubles. They're not doing this in order to revive old animosities, but because they want to give the dead a proper burial and the families a possibility for closure, a sense of closure, right? So they want to heal together and individually. And this is an important subject, of course, not only in Cyprus. It was important in Guatemala, in Chile, Argentina, in Spain after the Civil War, in Bosnia after the genocide, and most recently there are Yazidi families now digging the soil of Iraq for the bones of their relatives. So it is incredibly important you unearth so that you can heal together as a community. And the fig tree, in a way, gave me, that chance. But I really appreciate everything you said because I try to write with love. And there were moments when I found it really, really difficult to write, emotionally. Thank you.
Paul, there's a gentleman here, and then Paul, I'm going to pass. Will you pass the mic across? Yeah, sir. Come to you, and then I'll come to you, Paul. Yeah.
Hi, Faisal Sheikh. Can I bring you right back to storytelling?
Yeah.
And kind of a technical question. Who are you writing for? Or you mentioned, I really like what you said about the oral tradition. Who are you talking to when you're writing?
Very good question.
Will you hold on to that, Elif, and then Paul, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back about history and technology. And one of the things that you mentioned was the uprising in Tahrir Square. I had the great fortune to meet a documentary maker who made a documentary about the rise and fall of Tahrir Square. And one of the most interesting things he discovered was that no one was covering it in the media until the Twitter and the Facebook camps were created either end of the square. And at the same time, he also discovered that the old guys who'd been campaigning there for weeks before those things happened weren't really being paid attention to. And when the young came in, they ousted Mubarak and then they left. And the old guys are going, where are you going? And they're like, oh, we're done. We came to oust Mubarak and we're done. And you go, you've replaced Mubarak with an armed force. We're nowhere near done. But I think that was the problem with the birth of that social media, where it became the driver for news. And at the same time, you had a whole generation that found things simplistic in its delivery, so that at the point that they thought they'd achieved what they'd set out to do, which is ousting Mubarak, wasn't actually the thing that they were trying to achieve, which was obviously changing the state.
Thank you. Who am I writing for? I don't necessarily write with a single person in mind. And to be honest, I try not to think about who is going to read the book and how they're going to react. If I were to do that, I would be worried. And that would slow me down. When I am in the middle of a novel, I only think about the novel. And I try to stay in that zone as deep as I can, as long as I can. After I've finished, I give it to my editor. And then, of course, you get the anxiety attacks, the panic attacks. But by then, it's too late. The book is born. It has a life of its own. It's free. It's independent of you, and you have to respect that. But my point is, while I'm writing, I have to believe that those fictional characters are real. I have to believe that that imaginary world is real, and try in that zone. That doesn't mean that I don't care about the reader's opinion. Just the opposite. We were talking about this earlier. Maybe coming from Turkey, experiencing that loss of freedom of speech taught me that actually if books survive today, I really think it's because of readers. Because readers keep sharing books. In Turkey, and many of my friends from Pakistan and India and many parts of the world tell me it's similar for them as well. But in Turkey, a book is not an individual personal item. You just don't read and then put it back on the bookshelf. If you like it, you give it to your best friend. Your best friend gives it to her aunt. Suddenly the aunt sends it to her neighbor. The neighbor sends it to her son who is doing his military service. And suddenly the book is traveling. I have seen so many books, copies of my books, on book signing dates, underlined by different colored pens because different people read the same book. That is incredibly important because that's how books survive. We keep talking about books and that's very genuine. So the energy that comes from readers, that's why I really cherish environments like this. I really think we need literary festivals, book festivals, cultural festivals. Earlier, we talked about how the government is not supporting the arts, how the government is not supporting, literature, libraries are being shut down. All of this has consequences. During COVID, we've seen how arts was treated as if like it was a luxury, right? Something you could discard. It's not a luxury. So my point is that to me is very important, that energy coming from the readers. But that's after the book is written.
I can ask, how do you get into that state?
How do I get to that?
Into the state of, because it's difficult to write without thinking of who's, even a simple article, it's almost impossible to quiet that voice.
Yeah, absolutely. What I learned over the years is that writing never gets easier. And that's okay. And we need to take that as a fact. So people think, well, if it's your third book, fifth book, 10th book, now you know the trick. There's no trick. And depends on the week. Like one week you might feel like you're on top of the world. You have a great story. It's going to be amazing. You have to have that kind of confidence. Otherwise you can't keep going. But then the next week you just tumble down and you're crawling on the floor and you have panic attacks. That's also part of the writing process. Not everything you write goes into the book. You have to delete, erase, edit. That's incredibly painful. But my point is to keep going back to your desk and to read every day. That kind of discipline is very important for us. Not everything we write might be the best, but let's keep writing. So I want to add this because I find it important, especially for writers, especially for novelists, because it's such a lonely task. The energy has to come from inside, right? So we have to keep the inner garden alive. And if we start worrying about what other people are going to say about our work, we cannot work. We cannot write. So we have to have faith, confidence, but it's okay to have doubts as well. That's also part of the process.
Okay, thank you. And then Paul's question about changing and building.
With regards to Tahrir's, did I hear you right though? Is it like it was short-sighted, right? Because people thought it was very quick fix.
The very notion of social media changed how a generation thought about an issue.
Yeah.
So they were paying attention to the social media. They were not paying attention to the people who had been doing it for decades.
Yeah, I agree. I understand. And I think, again, it comes back to the importance of your work because journalism, like slowing down and to realize that you can't solve, first of all, what we're talking about are very structural, deeply rooted problems. You're not going to solve it in a week, with one protest. incredibly important for people to feel that kind of energy, but there are no quick fix solutions. So to think long term, but primarily solidarity, sisterhood, to hear each other's voices across borders. How do we connect? If there's one thing that really, really scares me, that's numbness, that's apathy. You know, when you read the memoirs of people who have experienced the Holocaust, the darkest chapters of human history, they're almost all of them saying the same thing. They're saying the opposite of good is actually not evil. You know, there are a few evil people, but very few, relatively, their numbers. It doesn't explain how atrocities can happen on such a massive scale. It doesn't explain that. How do you explain it then? So they explain it with apathy, with numbness. The moment we become disconnected, you know, it's someone else's problem. What's happening in Afghanistan, I'm sorry, but it's their problem. The moment I do that and I become desensitized, I think then it becomes easier for a small number of bad people to cause massive, massive damage. So how do we connect? How do we keep empathy alive? I really think it's a crucial question.
Elif, can we finish just by doing a little bit of analysis before the event, which is that your next book, There Are Rivers in the Sky, comes out in the summer.
Yeah.
So just, you know, pick up on the point about how you wrote it. Can you just tell us a little bit about that book? Whether you came up with a character, an idea, a thing you wanted to say, and what you hope and expect that book will do. I appreciate it's not until August that we'll get to read it.
Yeah, I appreciate. It's called There Are Rivers in the Sky. I always tell myself, you know, the next book, it's going to be very minimalistic. I'm going to keep it very simple. That's what I said to myself this time, and it didn't work that way. What I do is, I think there are two different ways of writing a novel. One is a bit more like engineering. As a writer, you want to be on top of everything. You want to know how the story is going to end before you start. And I have a lot of respect for people who write in this way. That's a bit more mathematical, a bit more like, from above. I don't write like that. I like the second path, in which you're a little bit drunk. You know, you don't quite know what you're doing. And you follow your intuition. But you respect that intuition, and you do a lot of research, learning. Whatever I write about, you know, mosquitoes in Cyprus, I have to read books about mosquitoes. Nothing is too small. Nothing is too insignificant. So as a novelist, I have to do my homework, right? But then there comes a moment when you can fly. And after that moment, you have to follow the characters. The characters will lead you, and they will guide you, and they will tell you. So that's how it was written. And it is a big book in the sense that it's an epic book. That's how it evolved. It's the story of three characters who seem to be completely different at first glance, but hopefully they are connected in a very surprising way. So three characters, two rivers, the river Thames and the river Tigris in the Middle East, which is dying. The river Tigris and the river Euphrates, they're both dying. You know, their water levels are receding. So two rivers and one ancient poem, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh. 3, 2, 1, and everything is connected via a single drop of water. And it's that drop of water that travels across centuries, continents, cultures, and connects everything. I really hope you will enjoy it. I mean, it's a story that was painful to write, but at the same time, I loved it. And the reason why I say I loved it, you're not supposed to say this as a writer, but we need to talk about love, right? We cannot produce art if we don't love what we're doing. So love has to be at the center of everything.
Okay, I think we can safely say we love this. We love this. Thank you.